The rain had been falling since dusk, not the gentle kind that taps softly on window panes and lulls children to sleep. This was Silver Creek rain in November, cold, relentless, and mean. It came sideways off the mountains, turned the streets into shallow rivers, and drove even the stray dogs to shelter. By 9 o'clock, the whole town had retreated indoors, and the only signs of life on Garrison Road were the amber glow of the Storm Wolves Motorcycle Club and the steady growl of thunder rolling through the valley. Inside, the clubhouse was exactly what you'd expect from a place run by men who'd spent their lives choosing freedom over comfort. The walls were covered in road maps, club patches, framed photographs of long rides, and a hand-painted sign above the bar that read, "Brothers by choice, family by blood, wolves by heart." A pool table sat under a hanging light in the corner. Cards were being played at one table. 3 men argued loudly about a football game on the old television mounted in the corner. Diesel, the club's president, a massive barrel-chested man with silver-streaked hair and forearms like bridge cables, was nursing a black coffee and going over maintenance schedules for the spring ride. It was loud, it was warm, it smelled like motor oil, leather, and something good cooking in the back kitchen. It was exactly the kind of place you'd never expect a child to knock on. But at 9:14 on that cold November night, 3 quiet knocks echoed against the heavy wooden door. Nobody heard them at first. The rain was too loud, the voices inside too many. Then it came again, softer this time, barely audible. Remy, a lean, tattooed man with sharp eyes and a quieter nature than most of his brothers, happened to be nearest the door. He heard it, not because it was loud, but because there was something in the sound that made the back of his neck prickle. He set down his drink and walked to the door without a word. When he pulled it open, the warm light of the clubhouse spilled out into the rainy dark, and what he saw stopped him completely. A child, maybe 12 years old, soaking wet, hair plastered flat against his forehead, a dried line of blood running from a small cut above his right eye. His jacket was thin, the wrong kind for this weather, and his shoes were so waterlogged that they made a soft squishing sound when he shifted his weight. But it wasn't the boy that made Remy's chest tighten. It was what the boy was holding. In his arms, wrapped in a wet towel that had long stopped providing any warmth, was a baby girl. She couldn't have been more than 2 years old. She was asleep, or close to it, her tiny fists curled against her chest, her small face pressed into the boy's neck. Even in sleep, even in the cold, she was holding on to her brother like she trusted him with everything she had. Because she did. Because he was all she had. The boy lifted his eyes. They were dark, serious eyes, eyes that had seen more than a 12-year-old's eyes should ever hold. He swallowed hard, and when he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, strained thin by exhaustion and something that sounded very much like the last edge of hope. "Please," he said, "can you hide my sister? He's going to hurt her tonight. I didn't know where else to go." For 3 full seconds, Remy stood completely still. Then he stepped back and opened the door wide. "Get inside," he said quietly. "Both of you, right now." The clubhouse went quiet the way a room only does when something shifts the air inside it. One by one, conversations stopped. Cards were set down. The football argument dissolved mid-sentence. Men who hadn't lowered their voices in years found themselves suddenly, instinctively, speaking in whispers. Diesel stood up from his chair. He'd spent 30 years on the road. He'd been in bar fights, stood down men twice his size, buried brothers, and survived things he didn't talk about. He was not a man who showed emotion easily or often.
But when he crossed the room and saw the boy standing in the middle of his clubhouse, shivering so hard his teeth were chattering, still holding his sister even though his arms must have been burning, still watching her face instead of looking out for himself, something cracked open behind Diesel's eyes that had been closed for a very long time. He crouched down so he wasn't towering over the boy. "What's your name, son?" "Ryan," the boy said. "Ryan Parker, and this is Lucy. She's 2. "Okay, Ryan." Diesel's voice was steady, careful. "You're safe here. Lucy's safe here. Do you understand me?" Ryan didn't answer right away. He just looked at Diesel for a long moment, the way someone looks at a thing they want desperately to believe, but have been disappointed by too many times to believe easily.
Then, very slowly, he nodded. What happened next in that clubhouse was something none of those men had planned, but all of them did without being asked. Blankets appeared from the back room, thick, heavy ones. 2 of the men pulled chairs close to the heating vent in the corner and arranged them without speaking. Someone went to the kitchen, and within minutes the smell of warm milk drifted through the air. A plate of food was placed on the table, bread, some pasta that had been made earlier, a bowl of soup. Big Red, a former military man who stood 6'4" and had hands that could bend iron, sat down cross-legged on the floor in front of Lucy and made a face that no one in the club had ever seen him make before, a ridiculous, wide-eyed, silly face. Lucy blinked at him. Then she giggled, and something about that tiny sound, that 2-year-old giggle in the middle of a motorcycle club on a rainy November night, hit every man in that room somewhere deep and unguarded. Axel, who was known for being the loudest man in any room, hadn't said a single word since the children came in. He stood by the kitchen doorway with his arms crossed and his jaw tight, watching Ryan eat, or rather, watching Ryan not eat, because Ryan had been given the plate of food first, and he hadn't touched it. He sat with Lucy on his lap, making sure she drank the warm milk slowly, making sure she was warm, checking her hands to see if the color had come back into her little fingers. Only when Lucy had eaten, only when she was wrapped in a blanket and her eyes were growing heavy with warmth and safety, only then did Ryan pick up the fork. He ate like someone who hadn't eaten in a very long time, carefully, slowly, like he was rationing the relief of it. "When did you last eat?" Axel asked quietly from the doorway. Ryan thought about it honestly. "Yesterday morning," he said. "I gave Lucy the last of the crackers around noon today." Axel turned around and went back into the kitchen. He came back with twice as much food. Later, when Lucy was asleep on a makeshift bed that 3 of the men had quietly constructed in the back room, cushions from the couch, 2 folded blankets as a mattress, another as a cover, Diesel sat across from Ryan at the table and listened. Ryan told him everything. He told him about his stepfather, Marcus, how things had started going wrong 3 years ago after his mother got sick and couldn't work, how Marcus drank, how the drinking changed him, how the first time was a shove, and then it was something worse, and then it became something Ryan had learned to predict and prepare for, how he'd gotten good at reading the warning signs, the particular way Marcus's voice dropped when the anger was coming, the look in his eyes, the way he moved through the house. "I could protect myself mostly," Ryan said quietly. He said it without pride, just as a fact. "I learned how to stay out of the way, but Lucy," he stopped, looked at his hands. "She's too little to understand. She doesn't know to be quiet when he's like that. She doesn't know to stay in her room. She's just a baby." He told Diesel about that afternoon, about what Marcus had said, about the look on his face, about the way he'd moved toward Lucy's room. Ryan had grabbed his sister and run. He didn't know where he was going. He just knew he couldn't stay. He'd been walking for almost 2 hours in the rain when he saw the lights of the clubhouse. "I've seen you guys before," Ryan said, "riding through town. I didn't know if you were good or bad." He looked at Diesel directly. "But I was out of choices." Diesel held the boy's gaze for a long moment. "You made the right call," he said. "I need you to know that. Whatever happens next, bringing your sister here tonight, that was brave. That was the right thing."
Ryan didn't say anything, but something in his face shifted, like a weight had been redistributed, not removed, but shared, like for the first time in a long time, he didn't have to carry it all alone. "Where's your mom?" Diesel asked. Ryan was quiet for a moment. "Hospital," he said. "She's been there 6 weeks. She doesn't always know what's happening." His voice didn't waver, but his hands tightened in his lap. "I visit when I can." Diesel sat back. He looked at this 12-year-old boy, this child who had been quietly holding an entire family together with 2 hands and sheer stubborn love, and he felt something settle inside him like a decision being made at the deepest level. He stood up and walked to the back of the room. The men gathered. No announcement was needed. They'd all been listening.
What happened next would not be talked about much in Silver Creek in the days that followed. The men of the Stormwolves Motorcycle Club weren't people who sought recognition, and they didn't need to explain themselves to anyone. But here is what happened. Calls were made, quietly, methodically, with the kind of calm efficiency that comes from men who know how to organize quickly when something matters. A retired police officer who rode with the club on weekends, a man named Garrett, made the first call to a contact in the county sheriff's department. Within the hour, a social services emergency line had been contacted, documentation had been started, and a formal record of the children's situation had been established. 2 of the brothers drove to the hospital to check on Ryan's mother. They sat in the waiting room for 2 hours. They spoke to a nurse. They made sure someone who worked at the hospital had a number to call if anything changed. By 2 in the morning, 2 more brothers had quietly driven past the Parker house. Marcus's truck was in the driveway. The lights were on. They parked down the street and waited, watching, making sure no one left that house until morning brought the proper authorities. They didn't have to do any of this, but not one of them questioned it for a single second. Ryan fell asleep in the chair sometime after midnight, still wearing his damp clothes, his hand resting on the armrest as if even in sleep he was ready to move if he needed to. Someone draped a blanket over him without waking him. Someone else turned off the overhead lights and left just the low lamp in the corner burning. The clubhouse that had been loud and rough and ordinary at the start of the evening was now quiet as a church. Diesel sat in his chair near the door and drank his cold coffee and watched the rain. He thought about his own childhood, about a night when he was not much older than Ryan, when things were hard in a way he'd spent decades trying to forget. He thought about the people who had helped him then, one of whom was a man most of the town had considered rough and dangerous, a man who had, nevertheless, sat him down and fed him and told him he wasn't alone. He thought about how a single act of protection offered at the right moment can redirect the entire course of a life. He thought about the club motto, the one they'd had since the beginning. Not all wolves hunt the weak. Some run to protect them. He looked at the sleeping boy across the room. Yeah, he thought quietly, this is what it's for. Morning came gray and slow, the rain finally easing into a thin mist that hung over the mountains like a veil. Lucy woke first. She sat up in her cushioned bed and looked around the unfamiliar room with wide, curious eyes. Then she found Ryan across the room, still asleep in his chair, and she seemed to decide that wherever Ryan was, she was okay. She toddled over to Remy, who was sitting at the table with a cup of coffee, and held up her arms. He picked her up without hesitation. She looked at his tattoos with the profound, unapologetic interest only a 2-year-old can manage, and began poking at the ink on his forearm with one small finger. "Dragon," she announced. "Close enough," Remy said. Ryan woke up at 7. For a moment, confusion crossed his face, the blank, disoriented look of someone waking in an unfamiliar place. Then memory returned, and he sat up quickly. "Lucy?" "Right here." Remy turned so Ryan could see her, still perched on his arm, currently fascinated by his watch band. Ryan let out a breath that seemed to empty him entirely. Then he put his face in his hands for a moment, just a moment. When he looked up, his eyes were dry, but they were red at the edges. "What happens now?" asked Ryan.
Diesel sat down across from him. "Now," he said carefully, "some people are coming who can help. Good people. People whose job it is to make sure you and Lucy are safe and that you stay together, because that's what you both need." He held Ryan's gaze. "We've already made sure of some things. Marcus won't be walking away from what he did, and there are people looking at options for you and Lucy. Good options, but it's going to take a little time, and we're going to make sure someone's watching every step of the way." Ryan was quiet for a long moment. "And my mom?" he asked. "We've got people checking on her," Diesel said. "She's not forgotten."
Ryan nodded. Something in him seemed to settle. Not into peace exactly, but into something more manageable than what he'd been carrying. Something that felt, for the first time in a long time, like it could possibly be survived. In the weeks that followed, the Storm Wolves Motorcycle Club became something of an unofficial guardian force for Ryan and Lucy Parker. They attended hearings. They provided written statements. They connected the family with a legal aid attorney who was also a friend of the club. When Ryan's mother began a slow, uncertain recovery and needed support navigating the system, two of the brothers drove her to appointments. When the children were placed in a temporary foster situation 2 towns over, the club ensured it was a good home and showed up twice a week to visit, showing Ryan that he hadn't been forgotten, that the promise made on that rainy November night was not temporary. They fixed a bicycle for Ryan and taught him basic engine maintenance on a Saturday afternoon, which was the first time any of them saw him genuinely, unguardedly smile. Lucy, for her part, had decided with the absolute confidence of the very young that Remy and Big Red were her personal property. She had renamed Big Red Gorilla. He did not correct her. None of this made the news. None of it was posted anywhere or announced. It didn't need to be. It was just men who had been given a choice, turn away or step forward, and had chosen without hesitation. The knock on the door had lasted 3 seconds. What had started lasted much longer, because sometimes the smallest sound, 3 quiet knocks in the rain from hands too small and too desperate and too brave, carries enough weight to move mountains. And sometimes the roughest-looking doors open into the warmest rooms. And sometimes the people the world has decided to be afraid of are the very ones who stand between the innocent and the dark. Ryan Parker, age 12, had walked 2 miles in a November storm to knock on a door he wasn't sure would open. It opened, and every man on the other side of it was changed, quietly, permanently, by what came through it. A boy, a baby, and love so fierce it walked barefoot through a rainstorm to keep its promise. Paths of honor. Some roads are paved. Some are washed out by rain and desperation and impossible choices. The ones that matter most are the ones walked anyway. For every child who has ever protected someone smaller than themselves in the dark, you are seen. You are not alone. And somewhere, a door is always open.